Hi everyone. This is a short lecture on policy analysis. We're going to spend some time today talking about sort of what changes as a result of policy. How do we think about that? How do we convey it to others? How do we measure it? So on and so forth. Before we begin, we should talk about these two ideas of content and process. Content is sort of what's in the policy. What it talks about, what it intends to do. Process, on the other hand, is sort of the change that the policy instigates or catalyzes, or sort of creates. There's an interesting sort of parallel idea of content and process in really clinical forms of social work. So the content, so you can sort of imagine a clinical setting or something like that. The content of a session would be regarded as what's being said, and the language used by the client and the therapist. And the process, on the other hand, would be sort of the emotional content underlying that content. And there are times frequently in clinical work where content and process are different, and sort of one of the appropriate tasks given this, again, sort of dependent on the situation, but one of the appropriate tasks might be to get content and process to line up. There's a similar idea sort of in policy analysis. Process sort of is what's going on underneath. What's the change that's sort of, like I said, instigated by the process. Content is really what's in the text of the policy itself that it says it wants to do. So just as in clinical practice, there can be times when content and process really are different. And frankly, there's disagreement in the policy analysis world over whether we should be focusing on the content or the process. And as with everything sort of in the policy world, there are conflicts. It's a highly political process, and so what we're really going to be talking about here today is sort of the different models of policy analysis. No one is the best. In fact, frankly, there are probably models of analysis that should be deployed in different situations given a population, a problem, a policy, and so on. At any rate, the policy analytic methods that we're going to be talking about today can sort of generally be divided into these two categories called rational analyses and political analyses. The rational proponents are sort of the group that's more objective. They're often using quantitative methods and sort of reporting on what was the change in the target problem or the social issue, what improved or what changed, or what decreased as a result. So you often see rational approaches with conclusions like problem X decreased by 10%, or the cost of dealing with X decreased by $150 million or something like that. The political approach, on the other hand, is often uses much more qualitative approaches. And if we go back to the last slide, the political approach is really sort of focused on the process. So what is it like to sort of live underneath a particular process, and how did sort of the process of someone's life change as a result of that particular process. The political approaches, like I said, they often are using qualitative methods, but they're often much more abstract and they're often much more detailed and nuanced. Again, I'm not convinced that either one of these is superior to the other. I think both of them have their appropriate uses given who the audience is for the policy analysis, and then sort of given who the population of interest and the problem of interest and things like that are. Nevertheless, there are some kind of common elements in policy analysis, and they sort of generally follow the list that's on the screen here. So, oftentimes a policy analysis starts with formulating the problem and identifying the problem. What's the issue we're trying to address? This is often something we're trying to increase or decrease. Then there's often a historical analysis of the social problem and its responses. So how has the problem evolved or changed over time? What forces shape and influence it? What kinds of things have we done in the past to try and ameliorate that problem? And then there's some analysis of values some assessment of values and ethics. So what's it say about us as a society that we let this problem get to this level? What's it say about us if we don't do anything? What's it say if we do something at a certain level? After that, there's usually some discussion of the various elements or ingredients of a policy. So what are all of the sort of tangible things that a policy is going to do? Is it going to give money to certain programs? Is it going to create certain programs? Is it going to change the way a particular process is handled or something like that? And oftentimes there's multiple things or multiple ingredients in a particular policy. There's an assessment of feasibility. So how feasible is it to institute this kind of thing? A discussion of alternatives. What would stronger policies look like? What would weaker policies look like? Oftentimes there's a no action alternative. What would it look like if we did nothing? And then there's some kind of evaluation, which is typically a selection of the best of the alternatives, or the one that was sort of voted on by a constituency in that alternatives piece. And that's what's reported in the evaluation. So let's walk through some of these different elements here. So in problem identification, really what we're doing, let me move my screen real quick so you can see the words here. There we go. So I always get a kick out of this quote by Mark Twain. Mark Twain said, "For every complex problem, there is a simple answer which is wrong," and that's often true in the policy world. There are people are often easily able to come up with simple answers, and oftentimes they're frankly wrong. At any rate, what problem identification is doing is really discussing the scope and extent of a particular problem. That's what Ginsburg is talking about when she references Murray and Ginsburg. Murray in particular is talking about the problem of large number of young single mothers who have children because they perceive the availability of financial support. Some people would argue with Murray. In fact, people did, because this was something that happened in really the 80s and 90s. Some people would argue that, well, that's not the problem. And so even simply identifying the problem is a political process, and sort of narrowing down what is the problem is often rife with conflict. But what I want to point out about this slide is really what's in this third bullet point here, and that's that beginning with a problem really shapes the rest of the policy analysis process. And for people like Murray and Newt Gingrich, and then certainly people on the liberal side of things too, beginning with a particular ideological stance can influence what that problem is, and then really how the rest of the analysis is carried out. So identifying the problem really has to be done sort of thoughtfully and carefully, and the point is to reach a broad consensus on what constitutes a problem. On the other hand, I just was going to put my screen recorder down in the other corner so that the text is visible. So on the other hand, a man named William Julius Wilson, a sociologist, saw the problem not as young single mothers who were encouraged to have children, but he saw the problem really as a function of unemployment, lack of education, and skill training for young men that led to high rates of incarceration and mortality, and it left the women with children who had fathers who were incarcerated or who were deceased. Whereas on the previous slide, Gingrich and Murray were coming from the conservative side of things. William Julius Wilson famously came at things from sort of the liberal political side of things. So the question really becomes, who's right, who's correct? And you can sort of see, and if you think back to some of the stuff we've talked about throughout this semester and things you may have encountered at other points in your academic career, you can sort of see how both of these problem identifications led to very different sort of analyses of problems to ameliorate, led to very different policy analyses. Okay, moving on, and I will put my picture back up in the corner there. A couple of other common elements here. Let's just talk through them. Sort of that historical perspective. What do we do with other approaches? You know, what have we done at other points in history? What have other countries done? That kind of thing. There's often a specification of goals, and that really comes. That really comes in sort of this assessment or this part of the policy analysis here, that discussion of various elements and ingredients. Let me just go back forward again here. And remember, goals can be both implicit and explicit. The explicit goals often resonate very much with those rational policy analysts. The latent and secondary goals sort of often resonate with people who are interested in the process or the political models of policy analysis. So then values, ethics, special lenses, that kind of thing. So what's the merits on which the policy is based? What does it say about us if we do things or don't do things? And then, of course, the discussion of various elements or ingredients. And that's sort of the specifics or the mechanisms by which the policy produces change. Again, that's oftentimes, let me just go back. That's oftentimes funding for a particular program or some changing of a process or something like that. I guess I don't need to move my picture. Again, the assessment of feasibility often includes things like workability. If there's enough money in a given, pot of money or something like that, is it legally feasible? Is it going to pass tests of constitutionality, things like that? Is it administratively feasible? Is it, can we create a bureaucracy to sort of institute the policy, or is one already, created that we can sort of leverage? Is it politically feasible? Are people going to support it? And that's oftentimes something we ask the public as well. So then there's the discussion of alternatives. What are the other things we can do? What happens if we do nothing? What are the unintended consequences? So on and so forth. And then, of course, the evaluation. Did it work? How do we know if it worked? And then the all-important question really in policy analysis, which is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And I actually am realizing that there's a mistake on the slide right there. It says, do the costs outweigh the benefits? It should say, do the benefits outweigh the costs? We always want benefits to outweigh costs, which means, we've done more good than we've invested in terms of money. So I'll just put myself down here again. Couple of different models of policy analysis advanced by some men named Birch and Chambers. So Hobart Birch, his model was to identify the issue, analyze what currently exists, determine what should be, and then decide what is possible. So he was sort of a political analyst, and his idea was to analyze the current state of situations, then determine what the ideal set of circumstances should be, and then determining how you got there was sort of the deciding piece on what was possible. Donald Chambers came along after that, and he was really interested in sort of the operational characteristics of the policy. He was really interested in formulating goals and objectives. What were we going to reduce or eliminate or change? What were we going to increase? And then he was really interested in sort of the forms of benefit. So, how did we distribute things to people so that they could so that we as a society could get to the place where a particular social problem didn't exist? Trotman came along in the late 80s, and his model was even a little bit different than that of Birch and Chambers. In his model, you define the problem, you developed a proposal, then you made a decision about that proposal. That was often just an up or down vote, a yes or no. Some models of his included things that where you might decide between a couple of different proposals. So that could be part of it as well. But then, given the results of that decision, there's the planning and program design. Then you go on and implement that as part of the planning and program design, and then you evaluate it, right? So after you design the program, you implement it in the programming and evaluation phase in Trotman's model. There are, believe it or not, even more models here that we'll mention real quick. So Dobbelstein's model. Dobbelstein's model had to do with identifying and coming to an understanding or consensus of the problem, and then identifying the places in sort of the development of a problem where a policy could create change. After that, you specified some solutions, and then among those different solutions, you tried to predict the best, or the one that sort of produced the most desirable outcome, and that was the way that you selected the best policy. Jansen's model after that also had to do with analyzing the problem. Very similar to what Dobbelstein did. But then in Jansen's model, you really found a policy that existed among existing policies, so things that had been tried elsewhere, things that had been tried at different levels. And that's the one that was sort of implemented in his model. And then Jansen was also a political theorist who thought that one of the things that you had to do was convince other people to accept that your course of action or that course of action was the best way to go. Gilbert and Terrell were really asking 4 different questions as a part of their method of policy analysis. They were asking, what are the bases of social allocation? What types of social provisions do we have to allocate? What are the strategies for delivering these provisions? And then who finances or who pays for them? Let's just spend a minute talking about these. So when they ask what are the bases, which is really the plural form of basis, but what are the bases of basis, B-A-S-I-S. So what are the bases of social allocation? That's really asking, how should we determine who we should help? What's the criteria for determining who gets to receive assistance? And then in the second question, what are the types of social provisions to be allocated? What they're really saying is, what kinds of things do we have at our disposal to give to people who we determine to be sort of worthy or deserving of help? And then question 3 asks, how do we give it to them? Which way do we do it? And then the fourth question is asking who pays. So who pays for the things that we're going to distribute to people that we deem worthy of redeeming help. So as you can see here, policy analysis work really sort of borrows an awful lot from economics. It borrows an awful lot from the study of politics and political science, that kind of thing. It's a fairly interdisciplinary kind of thing. So some of the really general principles of policy analysis is this idea of who wins and who loses. So who's going to get benefits? Who's going to pay for those benefits? That sort of falls along the lines of who wins and who loses. And that really speaks to the importance of financing. this policy analysis kind of thing. If we were to go back a couple of slides to that sort of historical political debate over that was sort of between Murray and William Julius Wilson over this idea that social programs created dependency among single mothers. The winners might be people who were able to become dependent, sort of not work as a result of the social programs that we had in the 80s and 90s. And the losers, of course, would be people who paid for those policies. Now, remember, that's a highly political way of thinking about things, and one of the things that happened sort of in the historical path of our country was that the winners and losers started to resent one another, and that sort of is a precursor to some of the factionalism and tribalism that we see today. This idea of who wins and who loses sort of sidesteps the issue of values. Which is why the values discussion is a big part of policy analysis as well. Let me just put myself down here again so I don't cover up the words. So oftentimes the other thing we want to assess is a policy implemented correctly or like it was supposed to be. So that's a little bit different than asking if the policy worked. Which is really sort of what policy analysis itself does. Assessing policy implementation is something that's a little bit different. So really, policy implementation is asking what's in that second bullet point there on the screen, and it's asking, was it implemented in the same way it was written by the legislature? But then, of course, always in a policy implementation analysis, you might be deciding what outcomes are you going to measure. You're watching for displacement of goals, so that's when other goals become more important than the things that were originally identified. And of course, one of the other things to keep in mind is that assessments of policy, one of their shortcomings is that they frequently don't highlight a program's merits. So policies typically do good things, and they do things on which they fail. They're not necessarily bad things, although some policies do produce bad things, but they are simply points where they are ineffective. And it's very often the case where a policy has something good that it does, and then it has something bad that it does. And as sort of part of that political process, we often only talk about the bad things or the good things. We don't often talk about a mix of the two. However, I will say that a good policy analysis will talk about both the good things that a policy does and sort of the things that it failed on or its shortcomings. Just advance this slide here. So I said a second ago that good policy analysis borrows from sort of the domains of economics and politics, and in addition to social science. It also really draws heavily on research designs, and the best policy analyses are not correlational, but they are longitudinal, so they track things over time. They often include really rigorous design elements, so good policy analyses can have comparison groups. They might even have an experimental group and a control group. The drawback, of course, to more rigorous designs is that they take more time and they're more expensive. And some policy evaluators will even hedge against positive findings because the life cycle of a policy is decades and decades and decades. But again, the whole point of this slide is just to sort of remind you that policy analysis sort of dovetails with research methods, which is of course another class that social workers take. And the same thing that's true in research methods is true in policy analysis as well, which is to say that the more rigorous designs, the more validity or more credibility of studies' findings are going to have. There are a couple of things that are sort of not in the text that I just want to highlight real quick. So the first thing is that programs often change as they are implemented. So policies are written, and then it's up to a specific group of people to really implement what's written in those policies. And the fact of the matter is that things change. Something is found to be infeasible. Things have to be adjusted, and that's fine. That's just the way things are done. But that often means that the plan to evaluate things then has to change. The other thing that the book doesn't highlight as much as I sort of wish it had is the importance of values, and the importance of sort of our national set of values in the way policy is talked about and shaped and implemented and evaluated. I don't think we should leave that behind. You have to remember that social work is really a values and ethics driven values and ethics driven profession. And so the way we think about policy should be, too. So even good, traditional, quantitative evaluations have limitations. They sort of condense things down into numbers, and that's useful times, but it's not useful at other times. There's this thing called social desirability, which is where people change their answers based on a desire to appear more favorable to a researcher or an interviewer. There are times when we don't use triangulated approaches, which is simply using several methods to sort of cross-validate information about a particular problem. And this is really one of the places where qualitative evaluations can step in. Now, qualitative evaluations, of course, are more labor intensive. They typically use smaller sample sizes. But what they really excel at is understanding sort of how something changed from an individual's perspective. And the things that change might be different from individual to individual, but that often is important knowledge in a policy evaluation. So just to highlight a couple of things from the readings this week. So Donito and Johnson are the steps of policy analysis that they're talking about is identifying the problem, looking at the causes of the problem or the nature of the problem, how it changes over time, comparing a couple of different policy alternatives, sort of thinking through the extent to which all of the proposals address a need, determining how much one of them costs, and sort of selecting the best one. Donito and Johnson really talk about policy analysis as a process of kind of multidisciplinary inquiry, which we've talked about during this lecture today, aimed at creating sort of this critical assessment of policy and policy relevant information. Donito and Johnson do a nice job of talking about the unintended effects of policy, so what changes that we didn't necessarily intend to change, and then they do a nice job talking about the recommendations. What recommendations can we make from analyses to sort of refine or help evolve a policy? Then there's sort of this other way to evaluate policy that Donito and Johnson talk about, and they sort of are asking: is it possible? Is it politically feasible? Is it useful? And these are all things that are talked about in the New York Times article. I'm sorry, it's a video. It's a New York Times video that's on D2L. And then, of course, Hayes and Mickelson in the reading for this week, which is on D2L, they talk about a couple of different models of policy analysis, and broadly those policies are the institutional analysis, the process analysis, the group theory analysis, the elite theory analysis, the rational model analysis, and then the incremental model analysis. So I'll just take you through those real quick. But the institutional analysis asks how policy interacts with existing agencies and approaches. So we live in a time right now where we're very good at building policy, and we don't often take down old policies. And so we have to think about how policy sort of interacts with that existing system. So the process model asks how it evolves politically. The group theory model of policy analysis really involves accessing stakeholders to ask them how their lives have changed as a result of policy. The elite theory asks how the lives of elites, the very wealthy or the very powerful, have changed as a result of policy. This is, in my mind, I think the elite theory piece is relevant today given the levels of income inequality that we see in the U.S. But then that rational model really corresponds to the rational model that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation today, which is sort of this quantitative model where you're looking at what's changed in terms of numbers, what's changed objectively in terms of the policy. And then the incremental model asks really if we're incrementally better off than we were without the policy. So the incremental model sort of acknowledges that it's difficult to get to an idealized end state, but it asks, are we a step closer to this idealized end state? So are we incrementally better than where we were? All right, so that's everything. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know.